Well, good morning or good evening or good afternoon, my lovely students. Here we are already, lecture number 2, baby. And today we're focusing on the Ching Dynasty. Well, here are the essential questions for this presentation. You might get a kick because you're going to hear some different background noises. I was taping this at home. There's a thunderstorm going on at one point. Somebody was mowing the lawn, so you might hear lots of interesting background noise. Essential question number 1 is, what was the White Lotus Rebellion and why was it important? Number 2 is, what was the Opium War and why was it important? Number 3 is, what was the Taiping Rebellion and why was it important? And then finally, who's this interesting character called Sushi? So those are the interesting essential questions. Let's get going. Last lecture, we talked about this dynasty called the Ming Dynasty, which saved China from foreign intervention at the hand of the Mongols. And then we talked about the Qing Dynasty, the dynasty that saved China from intervention at the hands of the Japanese. They were trying to work their way into Korea. And you might remember, if you were in 1181, when I showed you portions of The Last Emperor, the movie about the little kid who was the emperor. He was the last Qing emperor. Hallelujah. So we're going to take this right up to the 20th century in this class. And I think you're going to find that fascinating and familiar. Now, here's the thing. We're going to focus on China in roughly the year 1800. We're going to focus on this Qing Dynasty. And the Qing Dynasty was initially extremely successful. I mean, think about the things that they did. They pacified the country. They protected it from exterior invasion, and they pacified the country internally from ambitious provincial leaders. So that's big. I mean, feeling safe is huge. And people in China were grateful to the Qing for doing this. Something else they did, which was very popular, is they worked a lot on infrastructure improvement. I talked about Shi Huangdi's Magic Canal, how they made it navigable again, made it usable again. They built roads, they improved canals, and this fostered a lot of economic activity and wealth. Something else they did was, and this is greatly important for China's psyche, is they engaged in territorial expansion, particularly to the arid but valuable lands of the West. You can see the map of China looks pretty much like the map of China today. Now, here's the downsides. Remember, a lot of Chinese looked at them as foreigners. They were from Manchuria. They were Manchus. And even though they adopted Chinese culture, there was this feeling like they didn't quite belong. Something else that happened as a result of their successes with infrastructure and increased economic activity was a massive population explosion. I talked about this in the last lecture. China's population was 350 million in 1800. That's probably 35% of the world population at the time. And what happens with population growth is it leads to all kinds of stresses and strains in the system, and that was certainly true of China. Now, one thing that China did is very xenophobic, and they had this system called the Canton System, which I described last lecture. All European commerce was funneled through this port city of Canton in the south of China. And the Europeans tried to get their foot in the door. Remember the Monarchy mission and what an abject disaster that was. So you have China in a situation in 1800 where there's a lot of things under the lid which are ready to boil up. You have environmental degradation, skyrocketing population, really the inability to handle all these people, and a total unwillingness to look outside for help. And I'm going to tell you something, man. The Europeans thought the Chinese in 1800 were ridiculous people, totally with their heads buried in the sand, refusing to accept the modern world. The Qing Dynasty was definitely feeling the strains by the year 1800. But one fascinating chapter is the White Lotus Rebellion that took place from 1794 to 1804. So a decade experience. Now, to understand the White Lotus is key. The area where this rebellion takes place is a central Chinese province called Szechuan. You may have heard of Szechuan cooking. It's very spicy. I like it. But here's the thing. This concept of the White Lotus is something that didn't start in 1794. It's a Buddhist idea. This concept, they're a religiously motivated group, and they tend to want to rebel against corrupt governments or governments are controlled by foreigners. And you have to understand that many people in China looked at the Qing as foreigners. They're Manchus. They're from Manchuria. They're not Chinese. The White Lotus Society was active during the rule of the Mongols. Then it would go into a period of decline or hiding, and then it would reemerge again. So it reemerges again in 1794, and it starts as a simple tax revolt. In other words, local tax officials are corrupt and they're scamming people. Gained a lot of support of the locals, and then all of a sudden they started to conquer territory. So the Ching Dynasty freaked out about this, and for 10 years they battled sporadically this White Lotus rebellion. Now, obviously the White Lotus was not successful. One thing that was really interesting about the White Lotus is they looked at the second coming of the Buddha, very similar to what some Christians look at as the second coming of Jesus, Book of Revelations. Very similar ideology. Fascinating. But here's the thing, man. The White Lotus rebellion is evidence of this phenomenon in Chinese history of once the local leaders become corrupt, there's going to be rebellion. The concept in 1181 of the mandate of heaven, this feeling that the Qing dynasty among many Chinese is illegitimate. The next episode of this story is just tragic and disgusting. You have to understand how many people outside of Europe and North America just look at imperialism, the concept of Europeans and Americans going out and getting colonies, as one of the bleakest times, most shameful times in world history. And this is a great example. You see, China was closed to ideas and trade from Europe, from North America, and that really upset people in Europe and North America because of that large China market. So the British did something which was incredibly dastardly and sounds like contemporary American conversations. They decided to take a crop, opium, from India, highly addictive narcotic, and start to sell it to Chinese through smuggling channels. In other words, they just couldn't take it into the country and just distribute it. China would never permit that. So they contacted Chinese smugglers and they started to import mass quantities of opium into southern China. Now here's the problem with opium. It's highly addictive. And once you start using it, you want more and more and more and more. It would be similar to, say, heroin today. And so what happened was the British started to get rich off this drug trade. And they wanted to do more of it. Now, the Qing Dynasty became alarmed at this development. This is in the early part of the 1800s, the early part of the 19th century. And so they debated something. It's crazy. They debated whether to just legalize it and tax it, sound familiar, or to stamp out this trade. They sent a emissary to the southern port city of Canton to meet with the British to talk about, hey, look, man, this is an awful thing you're doing. And the British were like, heck with you, man. And so the Chinese said, we're not going to let you import this terrible narcotic into our country. Britain declared war on China for China not permitting them to import narcotics into their nation. This is 1839 to 1842. It's called the Opium War. It's one of the darkest episodes in imperial history. And I want to tell you something, the Chinese were no match for the British in this war. The British had modern weapons, crafted, forged in the Industrial Revolution, and they absolutely wasted the Chinese on sea and on land. Every place they fought, the Chinese got obliterated. The British worked their way up the coast, went inland from Shanghai, and captured the city, the very significant Chinese city of Nanjing, which the British called Nanking. At this point, the Qing emperor surrendered. The Treaty of Nanking was signed in 1842, and it was like opening the floodgates. From this point forward, China is subjected to one humiliating treaty after another at the hands of Europeans, and all because, again, their xenophobia in the past would not allow them to embrace the Industrial Revolution. So they were at the mercy of Europeans. Now, check this out, man. The Treaty of Nanking ended the Canton System. In other words, there was going to be a lot of port cities through which European products could come, and this opened the incredibly important port city of Shanghai. Shanghai is at the mouth of the Yangtze River. It would be similar to New Orleans here in the United States. China had to give the United Kingdom Hong Kong, which became a British colony all the way up to 1997. Tremendously humiliating for the Chinese. The Chinese had to assume war guilt for starting the Opium War and then pay the British. They also, in a later treaty, gave the British a classification called Most Favored Nation status, meaning that any trade concession they made to any nation, they had to automatically extend to Great Britain. One interesting thing about this is it prevented China from being colonized by European countries because of this Most Favored Nation designation. So, in a sense, the European nations agreed to just kind of share China, and all could thrive and prosper. These treaties were really amazing, and in the 1860s, Britain had China sign a treaty that allowed them to sell opium legally inside the country. And also, European countries were able to get China to agree to allow Christian missionaries to work throughout the nation. Now, when you guys hear the word Christian missionary, you might have a very favorable impression of that. And in many cases, these Christian missionaries would go in and feed people and give them jobs and clothe them and set up hospitals and all those positive things. But it was tremendously humiliating to Chinese for them to be there. You have to understand that a missionary, by its nature, you're trying to convert somebody to something else. So imagine if a foreign missionary came to your house and tried to convert you to a religion that was different than your parents. They probably wouldn't be very receptive to that, to say the least. Now, in these port cities where the Europeans were able to get these footholds, they set up this incredible system. They would carve out whole parts of the city and create their little zone of occupation. In other words, there'd be a little British sector or an American sector or a German sector in these large port cities in China. And native Chinese were not allowed to go into these sectors. And if they did, they would be subjected to a lot of human rights abuses. So the upshot of all this is that China as a nation is almost stopping to exist. It's almost ceasing to exist, and it is experiencing incredible humiliation at the hands of the Europeans. China in the mid-19th century, roughly 1850, was in this time period of incredible transition. And to be honest with you, most of the forces were not positive for the Ching Dynasty. Now, the humiliation of the Opium War, just a decade before, undermined any type of Chinese confidence. And then there's two other concepts that I want to introduce to you here, because these two concepts are going to be powerful in creating one of the most violent civil war that you've never heard of. Now, the first one is this concept of the Hakkas. China is such a large place. It goes back so long in time. The term Chinese or China is a very generic term. There's lots of variety in the nation, both in terms of ethnic groups and geographic regions and peoples and histories. There's a group from northern China called the Hakkas who speak a variety of Chinese. But these people have an identity, and their identity is to migrate all around China. That's their thing. They're almost nomadic in that respect. So they go to various parts of China, and they work, and they form communities, and then they move again. And so there was this mass migration of Hakkas from northern China to southern China, which was more prosperous. And these Hakkas are going to be the launch pad. This Hakka identity is going to be the launch pad or the ignition for this amazing civil war I'm going to talk about soon. So that's the Hakkas. Now I want to tell you about something that's really disgusting and gross. It is called footbinding. It's this concept, this bizarre concept in Chinese history that you take young girls whose bodies are still very moldable, and you literally fold their feet in half. Oh my gosh, I just cringe thinking about this. And this was done for a couple of reasons. One, just cosmetics. They thought that it really looked awesome to have women's feet extremely tiny. They referred to them as lotus feet. But I think you guys are mature enough, you know that there are various sexual proclivities in the world. And there's a sexual proclivity among some, which is to have a foot fetish. In other words, be really turned on by feet. And this was a national fetish as far as Chinese culture was concerned. Many Chinese men were extremely turned on by feet. And when you see pictures of foot binding, you have to think, what are they thinking? Now, this foot binding thing just seems like this minor, trivial deal. It was a huge deal in China. And one thing about it is the Hakkas think that it is disgusting and perverse. And it's going to be one of the things that motivates a lot of people in this upcoming bloodbath. Well, in order to talk about this amazing event called the Taiping Rebellion, the most catastrophic global event that you've never heard of, I got to put things in perspective. In the mid-19th century, the Taiping Rebellion took place. In the mid-19th century, the American Civil War took place. The American Civil War is the bloodiest war that America has ever fought because obviously both sides were Americans. The casualty rate for the American Civil War, deaths-wise, was 700,000 people. Now, to put that into perspective, the Vietnam War, 60,000 Americans perished. So 700,000 is a lot bigger. In the Taiping Rebellion, they have no idea how many people died. Conservative estimates put it at 20 million. Aggressive estimates put it at 70 million. So tens of millions of people perished in this rebellion, which the American Civil War is dwarfed by comparison. And yet we're so fixated on American history. We think about that as this amazing event. What happened in China dwarfs that. So in order to get this whole thing started, we have to talk about this fascinating character called Hung Shi O Chu Wan, one of the most significant figures in the last 300 years globally. And again, you've never heard of him. He was a Hakka. And like most Hakkas, they migrated around and they worked very hard and they established themselves, but they were by no means on top of the social pyramid. But he embraced the Confucius ideal of you can get to where you want to go through education. So he tried to work his way into the civil service, but he kept failing the civil service test. So he became embittered. He became furious that the Ching Dynasty was somehow rigged, out to get him personally. Now, he started hanging around American and British missionaries, Protestant missionaries in the port city of Canton. He was very impressed with Christian ideology, but he decided to morph Christian ideology into more of a Chinese manifestation. And so what he came to believe was that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. And he created a movement called the Heavenly Kingdom of Peace. And they had one goal: to drive the hated Manchus out of China, to rid the country of these foreign rulers. Now, one other thing that was really interesting, he was absolutely opposed, as all Hakkas were, to the concept of footbinding. So not only did he appeal to poor Chinese, but he also appealed to Chinese women who joined his army, and he let them fight in battles, which was unheard of in the 1850s. So this guy is going to be an earthquake in southern China, an earthquake that the Qing Dynasty is really going to struggle to respond to. The Taiping Rebellion lasted from 1850 to 1864, 14 brutal years in China, and that coincides roughly with the American Civil War. And Hung Shi Ao Chuan, his soldiers were a definite threat to the Qing Dynasty. The Qing just could not defeat these people. So what this war did, I could go into the details of the war, but that's not important. It's a fascinating subject if you're looking for a good topic at the end of the semester to write about. But what the war boiled down to was this. The Taiping rebels took over the city of Nanjing, just upriver from Shanghai. And so the war was a prolonged siege of the city of Nanjing, and those Taipings, they just could not defeat them. Shanghai mushroomed in terms of population as a result of this because it was a big staging ground. Now, one question that some of you really smart kids might be thinking is, well, the Europeans don't like the Qing Dynasty. These people, these Taipings, are ostensibly Christians. Could they jump in there and maybe tilt the tide in favor of the Taiping rebels? And the answer was maybe. The British and the French in particular were very interested in doing more business in China, and so they looked at the Taipings as a potential opportunity. But once they got in there and they saw these people, they realized that they were a bizarre sect, a bizarre addition of Christianity that they didn't recognize. So they decided to keep their distance from supporting them, but also strike a blow at the Qing Dynasty. There was another daggone opium war. It's called the Arrow War from 1856 to 1860. And once again, the British and the French just did a number on the Chinese military and defeated them, got even more favorable provisions in the next treaty to end this war. And then once the Qing was once again defeated and more amenable to European incursion, they decided to throw their weight toward the Qing Dynasty and the Taiping Rebellion. And once the Europeans were supplying the Qing Dynasty, the Taiping Rebellion slowly and painfully wound down. But as you're going to learn here, it devastated the country. The Taiping Rebellion devastated China. And this devastation was not only economic. China was in desperate straits financially. They invested all this money to win the war, and there was virtually no revenue coming in. They had to pay indemnities to the European powers after the First and Second Opium Wars. But also the war itself devastated agricultural lands. So the country itself was suffering from productivity. Now, granted, the Qings won the war, but it's what we like to call in history a Pyrrhic victory. If you're familiar with Greek history, the Peloponnesian War was this massive conflict between Athens and Sparta that Sparta eventually won. But both sides were so weakened by the conflict, it was a victory not worth winning. So even though the Qings came out victorious, China's never going to be the same. Now, in order to try to develop some or generate some revenue, what the Chinese government did, which they had to do, was they had to decentralize authority in terms of revenue collection. So, in effect, what they did was they turned local provincial leaders loose and said, collect as much revenue as you can, do it however you can. And this empowered these people and took power away from the central monarchy. Key in this is a character by the name of Zheng Guofan. And this guy right here is the epitome of a provincial leader in China in the later Qing period who has amassed all this power because of decentralization. That's his significance. But something else that these local provincial leaders did was they relied heavily on foreigners as advisors and oftentimes business partners. So what that did was just increase more foreign influence. It also unleashed a lot more missionaries, which was controversial. So China is in this stage of it just seems like it's kind of breaking apart. Now, the central monarchy, fascinating story, came under the influence of a woman. Now, her original job by the name, her name is Su Shi. If you remember the Last Emperor movie, if you were in 1181, she's the bizarre woman in the beginning. She is the Empress Dowager. And she came to the Chinese Qing court as a concubine. Now, if you're not familiar with what a concubine is, it's like being a harem girl. It's a little higher than that. It's a little bit more respected than being a harem girl, but you are certainly not on the level with the king's main wife or queen. So she got pregnant, and the boy that she gave birth to eventually became the emperor. And so what she was able to do was act as a regent, pretty much tell this kid what to do, and this kid did it. And then he died, and she was able to elevate her nephew to emperor, and she pretty much told him what to do too. So even though she wasn't officially the emperor, she was the decision maker. And she was all about this decentralized power, giving the provincial leaders authority to collect revenues, and also she understood this concept that China needed to modernize, needed to industrialize, or else it was going to be increasingly irrelevant. Now, you can see this story is going to continue, but that's it for now. I can't wait to come back.